Thanks, Will. Appreciate it. All right, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Rob Francis. Again, I'm the Chief Information Security Officer here at DFS. We've really been looking forward to kicking off this Cyber Symposium for quite some time, so very excited to welcome everybody today. Our first panel this morning discussed really the current landscape of cyber regulation and talked a little bit more at the end towards the future of cyber regulations. And Will just gave us a really good overview of how DFS is working hard to modernize our supervisory efforts here at DFS. All of which leads us to our final panel of the day, where we're going to discuss some key cyber risks of 2022. But before we jump into the discussion, I just wanted to take a few minutes and briefly introduce today's panel. But please note that the panelists' full bios, they're available on the DFS website. So first, I'd like to welcome Tracy Grella, who is the Global Head of Cyber at AIG. She's responsible for the company's cyber-related products and services, which ensures that AIG is creating solutions and delivering expertise to help commercial and consumer insurance clients manage and mitigate evolving cyber risk. Next, I'd like to welcome Arez Lieberman, who is the co-chair of the U.S. Data Solutions Cyber and Privacy Group at Linklaters. He is recognized as a leading cybersecurity and data privacy lawyer, together with having deep experience in government investigations and litigation and a technical background as an aerospace engineer. And finally, I'd like to welcome Amit Kachia Patel, who is a supervisory special agent with over 17 years at the FBI. His broad experience ranges from foreign counterintelligence and insider threat to managing a team investigating nation-state sponsored attacks. Amit, thank you so much for your continued service. So we have a full agenda today. We're a little bit behind time, but we'll try to make up time there. And we have a great panel with the same rules of engagement as our first panel. But first, I just wanted to take a minute and really frame the conversation with a couple of numbers, and then we'll jump right in. So looking this up recently, estimates indicate that cybercrime cost organizations around the world about $6 trillion last year, which would make it the third largest economy in the world behind the US and China. That number is expected to rise to $10.5 trillion by 2025. Ransomware alone has cost the world $20 billion last year, and that number is expected to rise to about $265 billion over the next 10 years. On the flip side of that, cyber defense cost the world about $150 billion last year. So the challenges and the costs are clearly significant. So for me, two primary questions come to mind. What kind of threats are we facing, and what can we do about it? So Amit, can you kick us off here and really talk a little bit about what are some of the key threats that organizations are facing today?
Sure. Thanks for having us. So in terms of threats, some folks may not like my answer, but it's essentially come down to all of the above, right? So if you take a little bit of a historical perspective, over the last 10 years, with the larger cyber incidents, a lot of the indictments that we here at the Bureau have done, both on the criminal side as well as the national security side, you've kind of seen the gambit in terms of what you're facing from any actor set, whether they be criminal or nation state. And really what we've seen over the last 5 years is a blending of that threat. So just to kind of give you a small vignette, you go back to 2010, 2012 timeframe, right? The biggest, baddest threat out there was anonymous. And a lot of what they were doing was around gaming and around defacement of websites, right? You fast forward to 2014, and now we're talking about the Chinese going after intellectual property. But the way that they're doing that, if you look at the APT1 indictment, is, there's not really any real sophistication there. I mean, it's the spearfish, the click that gets them in to the network, and it's essentially a smash and grab. Right, then you move on from there, and then you've seen other things like Sony Pictures attack, where you're seeing, one of the first mass data deletion attacks that takes down a company overnight. Then we move into kind of the ransomware world, where we're seeing the North Koreans through WannaCry leveraging what's traditionally considered a criminal tool for currency generation for their regime. Fast forward to 2018, and now you're seeing managed service providers targeted by the Chinese, and then more recently over the last year, I know we'll talk a little bit more about this, but supply chain attacks. So you've seen kind of the realm of possibilities, over the last 10 years in terms of what you can expect from a cyber actor, whether they be criminal or nation state. And so for the audience and really from a network defense perspective, we should really be focused around the tactics, techniques, and procedures that an adversary is going to leverage. And, when it comes to a nation state, they're going to leverage whatever works, right? And they're going to use, the lowest end of the spectrum first, and then kind of move on from there, right? So, really having that full spectrum view of how to protect yourself, that's how we need to think about threats.
No, that's perfect. Thanks, Amit. And Tracy, any thoughts on the AAG side?
Hi, Robert. Thanks so much for having me today. So my role at AIG, I'm responsible for the cyber insurance practice. And so as a leader in cyber insurance, we have seen thousands of claims across the world. And absolutely, as Amit said, there's there's an endless amount of threats against organizations. The risks that we're seeing are really we've been focused on for the last year or two is ransomware, a significant amount of ransomware activity. And that's really been dominating the headlines and what we've been working on as an insurance carrier, the types of claims that are coming in, what we're talking a lot about. But we're at the same time, we're still seeing a lot of business email compromise claims, impersonation fraud claims, data exfiltration. We have seen some DDoS attacks. So there are a number of threats that and risks that are facing organizations today that we need to deal with from a cybersecurity perspective.
Perfect. Rez, any thoughts from Linklaters?
Yeah, look, and I've come from government as well. Before I was in-house at Prudential. Before that, I spent 10 years prosecuting hackers. I think we have seen the line between nation-state hackers and criminal hackers wither away. It's not gone completely, but they're both using the same tactics. Often it's the same hackers, just hired and using it for different purposes and wearing different hats. And that sophistication and the proliferation of hacking tools that was once reserved for the most sophisticated hackers, but has now gone to the least sophisticated hackers, has meant that we can see that crossover and really sophisticated attacks by unsophisticated attackers. I think that overall we see on top of ransomware, certainly business email compromise continues to be one of the leading loss figures, even though it does not get half the press or a tenth of the press as ransomware. Account takeover fraud is a huge element, certainly in the financial services industry, a combination of fraud, social engineering, and cyber. And insider risk is always a concern, as the first panel said. It's still there. It just has been drowned out by the constant discussion of ransomware.
Perfect. So we talked about business email compromise. We talked about ransomware, other fraud in the environment. So really, what should organizations be doing to prepare for such threats?
Thanks, Robert. And by the way, thank you very much for having me here today. It's an honor to join this panel and this group overall. I think the DFS and OCC, I got to give them credit as well, have really nailed it. You got to start with risk assessments. And these risk assessments, if you can take your risk assessment and put another company's name on top and it would be equally applicable, you're doing something wrong. It needs to be a bespoke risk assessment for your enterprise. You got to sit down, you review documents, interviews with individuals, and ideally also some red teams or actual review of the technical elements. I think that's where it starts. The OCC opinion recently in a cease and desist order talked about using those risk assessments, briefing the board about those, briefing a compliance committee, and then creating action plans. I think that's where it starts. You map those risk assessments to the regulations and to enforcement actions. And so that's how counsel's role really comes in, taking a look from those technical elements to the regulations like Part 500, but also other regulations and enforcement actions that have come out. Then I want to see an incident response plan that brings everyone together. I think too often clients and companies say, well, we've got an incident response plan. It tells our IT function, our InfoSec function, exactly what to do. And you can turn page by page and say, well, now image this. And then after you image it, you review it, and then you do the next technical step. And those are critical response plans. But an incident response plan that gets us where we need to go, and especially with new public company reporting requirements coming from the SEC and critical infrastructure, which will affect the financial services industry coming with a reporting law, we need to make sure the C-suite is involved. And so a 7 to 10 page incident response plan that brings together all of the functions and is not focused solely on the information security side is really critical. You got to line up your vendors It's a pet peeve of mine. Companies like to use the same vendors for setting up information security as for responding to information security incidents. The expertise is very different. I'm an aerospace engineer. People used to ask me chemical engineering questions. I don't know chemical engineering. And just because someone knows how to set up an information security system does not mean they know how to respond to it. And even worse, and I've had clients show me good web pages about incident response vendors. That's not an indication of actually being a good incident response vendor, right? You got to know who the good vendors are and work with them and line them up in advance. And we've seen some pushback from clients on that. I would highly recommend using the experts. And I'll quote Justin Herring on this, a CEO should not be testing their incident response plan for the first time during an incident. Get the CEOs, get the C-suite into the tabletop. If the CEO is going to decide who's paying ransomware payments, that CEO, he or she, should be in the tabletop to review that. And this is where I definitely want to hand it off to Tracy. I think you got to have good cyber insurance, and that's a critical preparedness step. So that's where I'll leave it off.
Well, Araz, I thought that was perfect and well said. And certainly, cyber insurance can help organizations in going through this process. So if you don't have key vendors that you're already working with, if you're a smaller organization and you don't have them on retainer, it is very important that you know who you're going to be working with. If you're buying cyber insurance, you can work with your carrier ahead of time to understand who the appropriate vendors are for these types of events. Carriers are working on these events, multiple events across the world on a daily basis. So we have a lot of expertise with what the strengths are of various vendors and how to bring a whole team together. And so I think it absolutely is a critical part of managing cyber risk. And also, cyber carriers can help with the assessment. If an organization needs help assessing their risk, carriers have done a lot of work to really understand what the root cause of these of ransomware events are and other types of claims. And we can work with you to guide you through how you look within our models, where you need to have improvement, where investments could be made to improve your risk profile. So partnering with a carrier can definitely bring a lot of benefits before an event happens, and then of course afterwards in actually helping implement the plan. But agree on everything that Araz said, and having the practicing the incident response plan is super important. And that's where we see companies sometimes fall down when a claim actually happens. There's a lot of disruption because they're not sure how to respond to that plan. And so that is a critical piece that needs attention.
Great, thanks, Tracy. Any thoughts from the FBI? A little bit different perspective, but obviously interesting and important as well.
Yeah, just to echo some of the sentiments that were already put forth. I've responded to large incidents, over the last 10 years. And you can essentially, the companies that do the best, the victims that do the best, you can essentially break it down into kind of 3 core competencies, right? And the first one is you build a network, right? You build a good, solid network with some good foundation to it. Then, you bring in a red team, you have someone hack the network, hopefully it's not when an incident happens, right? You take that and then you rebuild that network. And so the companies that are able to be iterative in those 3 competencies, they tend to do the best. One of the best companies that I saw, this is several years ago, was actually a nonprofit. And what they would do is they would bring in a red team every year, 18 months or so, and then they would incorporate those best practices, bring that red team back, and then do it all over again. And through that process, they were able to identify a nation state actor on their network, right? And something that kind of doesn't get talked about, I don't think, enough is there's a huge competition out there for talent, and you need good cyber talent to be able to identify this stuff on your network, to be able to respond, to be able to build the networks. And we're all kind of in that competition at the government level, at the private sector level. All of us can't be Google, Facebook, pay top dollar and get, the best and brightest out of these universities, right? So you really have to spend time building your team, providing them that training, giving them that caring and feeding, and build that over time. You do that, and you'll be in a good position.
Perfect. So I think we have a pretty good understanding of what the landscape is from a threat perspective. and how we're going to start dealing with some of those threats. And it starts and ends with me with governance. So when I was an examiner at the Fed, that's when I really started to develop a great appreciation for governance, from the board of directors all the way down to the first line of defense. So as I tell my team now, and I've told my teams in the past, everything for me in cyber starts and ends with governance. So Rez, can you talk to us a little bit about the C-suite and the board and kind of what they should be thinking about when they evaluate their cyber programs and what kind of questions they should be asking?
Sure. I'll go back to risk assessments. I think the C-suite should see the executive summary of risk assessments. And I say the executive summary, they're welcome to look at the whole thing. It's long and complicated. Let's give them a few pages that they will actually take a read on and see the results of that. Now, I will caution, though, that often these risk assessments are mapped to something like the NIST and scaled. And you get a 3.8 on the detect function, which is actually pretty good, even though that's out of 5. Maybe in the financial services world, you want to be a little higher at a 4, something like that. That's still pretty good. But they don't know. The C-suite and board doesn't know what that means, and they don't know some of the technical terms on that. And so we need to do a better job of breaking it down to them. I've heard a lot of board members and C-suite members complain that they're still getting way too technical a presentation. And frankly, I feel that they rely on that and they say, wow, well, thank goodness I've got a really good CISO. She knows what she's talking about and sounds like she is covered with that 3.8, 4.2, and that's where they do a little bit too much of a hands-off. I frankly don't think boards are asking the right questions. They ask questions like, do we have a strategy in place? Are we spending enough? Do we have the right controls in place? There are easy answers to those. Yes, of course we have a strategy in place, and we're spending just the right amount for our company. And we've got the right controls and are working on those. And those are easy answers to give. And it's tough unless you've got cyber expertise on the board to push back on those experts that are presenting. So I say use those experts to your benefit. Ask an expert, what didn't you get last year? What didn't you get to last year that you would have wanted to? If I gave you more money last year and more people last year, what would you have spent that money on? JP Morgan is reputedly spending $600 million on cybersecurity. That's a lot. Most companies aren't going to do that. But what is it that they're spending money on that we have decided not to spend money on? These are the types of things that the experts can inform the board as to where there are degradations and issues. Every company is making trade-offs all the time about security, which is often not so convenient, and convenience. Convenience for the company, convenience for customers. What are those trade-offs, and is it made at the right place? I think the C-suite and the board should know about those so that everyone's reaching that right risk calculus together. And if an answer is that there's no trade-off, that can't be, because the best way to secure customer data and money is to lock it in a vault and not have anyone use it, and that's not usable. So there've got to be trade-offs, and so we've got to be able to talk about those. I think if boards can ask those, we can have a much healthier discussion and transparency and not have the C-suite and the board rely on the expertise of the experts without really digging deeper. That's why I think the SEC is asking about board cyber expertise. I don't know that you need to have a cyber expert on the board, but you do need to ask the tough questions and use the cyber experts to really get to the tougher answers.
That's a great background and a great wealth of knowledge across the board for sure. So Tracy, when you think about AIG and the things that you guys are seeing, what are your thoughts in this space from the board all the way down to the C-suite?
So so I think that the boards that we speak to, they're still developing in how they want to handle this risk and to understand, as was saying, understand the what's being presented to them. And I think that was all really good advice. And bringing in, and you don't have to have an expert on the board, but you want to increase the expertise of the board. So you can bring in experts to partner with you to help do tabletop exercises. We see a lot of that. And make sure that they're educating. You have outside experts in security, educating the board members on key security issues and threats and the risks that they should be aware of. I think that boards, we see them pretty focused on taking some of those measurements, like, making the comparisons, as Arez was saying, look at what one company is doing. Why are you not doing that? And making those judgment calls that that's a decision that you are willingly making. measuring yourself against frameworks that are out there, but most importantly, measuring your progress. Where do we want to get to? And security is constantly moving and evolving. So it's not a one and done. We have our program together, we're good. There's always new threats, new development, new acquisitions, new products you're developing that you need to think about security within those products. So it's a constant conversation. And so we see boards setting up, where they are now, where do they want to go, and then measuring kind of that progress year over year. And we think that's really important. Definitely something that insurance carriers are looking for as well. We want to see that we're working with organizations that are improving every year. Security continues to move, and it's important that the risk management continues to move. So yeah, that's where we see what boards focus. They're definitely working on assessments, reviewing audits, making sure that they're trying to drive these improvements. But there's still a little discomfort, as really to knowing what the technical terms are. And that's why really bringing in this expertise in. It doesn't need to be an expert on the board, but bringing in this expertise for education and having the right metrics and monitoring that progression is really important.
Hey, Robert, can I add one more thing? I forgot. Jen Easterly from CISA, the director of CISA, put out a letter. She sent it to the National Association of Corporate Directors. If you Google Jen Easterly, CISA, National Association of Corporate Directors, you'll easily find it. Your directors of companies are reading this letter because they have it there. She talks about empowering CISOs, participating in tabletop exercises, thresholds for reporting to C-suites and boards. Highly recommend everyone take a look at Jen Easterly's letter and follow some of the advice she got, because I think your board members are going to be looking at that themselves.
Absolutely, that's great advice. And as Tracy was talking about, really being able to translate business into technology and technology into business is really a key component here. So, Amit, what are you seeing in this space with the FBI on your side?
Yeah, I mean, just on the topic that we were just discussing, I think that the boards do need somebody with a cyber background and someone who's tethered in that space, because, if you look at kind of the cybersecurity industry at large, there's a lot of lemons out there. Okay. In terms of products, that type of thing. So what we can't have is kind of check in the box security where we're just, doing a lot of compliance checks, applying frameworks, and as long as those are met, right, that is a good cybersecurity. Really, what you need is someone. There's always the notion of a wartime CEO versus a peacetime CEO, particularly on the cyber front, right? You need somebody with a wartime mentality, because as we've been talking about, the actors, the threats, they're constantly evolving, they're constantly changing, and so you really need somebody who's creative and a little bit of an out of the box thinker. And I think having somebody on the board that has that mentality, that can nurture and coach kind of the organization at large, it's important. In terms of what the Bureau has been seeing, we've got a lot of lawyers here. We're not short of lawyers in the United States. And more of what we see is, and I think it's a good thing, is we're seeing a lot of companies roll up their cybersecurity into the general counsel's office, and it takes care of a lot of things. It puts somebody who's got a risk-on mindset, with a law background, that's able to make decisions about trade-offs. We talked about spend, right? And what you see, as I was alluding to earlier, is whoever gets in front of that person and builds that personal relationship, they're the ones that are getting their product into a company, where we should really having other people kind of chime in and make risk assessments about what our product does. The GCs, I think, have been doing a great job in terms of becoming more cyber savvy. They can speak and talk to cyber just as well as a CISO or somebody on the board. So really, rolling that up into that apparatus, I think, is something that's been very beneficial for the industry at large.
It's perfect. And part of having really good governance across the board is having an incident response plan in place. So as you talked about this, everybody else speculated as well, as having an approved incident response plan in place, exercise it regularly, and make sure that it's improved over time. So, Amit, can you talk a little bit about and continue the conversation with how the FBI is really working with victim companies during an incident response?
Yeah, I think like the biggest part is engaging with the FBI. We've got over 100-year history, and in our history, our bread and butter is victim engagement. We do a good job of engaging with victims. We do a good job of protecting their privacy, and we've got a proven track record for it. So really, for everyone on this call and listening in today, reach out and make that point of contact, make that introduction to the FBI. We've got, I call them 56 franchises across the United States. We've also got 34 what we call legats, and that's our international presence. So all you have to do is just pick up the phone and say, I'd like to talk to somebody that's working cybercrime within the FBI, and you should be routed to someone in that local office that works this, because as an FBI, we got at least a core group of people that are working cybercrime. Here in New York, it's a little bit different. We've got, a little bit over 100 people, but even if, you're out in Arkansas, if you're in some of the states that are a little bit smaller in terms of our footprint, you're still going to find somebody that works this stuff, right? And so, having that engagement when an incident happens, we're able to provide you a little bit more than just, intaking, what you reported to us. So if it's a threat actor that we have some visibility into, we're happy to share some additional indicators of compromise that may or may not be out there in the public domain. And if it's a large incident, right, really over the last decade, over the last 5 years, the FBI has kind of been the belly button. Nothing against CISA, DHS, in terms of, bringing all the kind of tools that the government has to bear for a cyber incident. Just as an example, I handled Sony Pictures, back in 2015, which seems like a lifetime ago. But in that instance, right, Sony Pictures was able to reach out to our LA field office. We were able to bring agents on site with, we've got technically trained agents. So, to help with the incident response, we're able to bring in other resources within the government, DHS, CISA having their incident responders on scene, bring in, IC elements like the NSA, for example, and then really kind of help Sony, from an incident response perspective, work with their third-party mitigator, with the proper memorandums in place. And then also we're able to talk to the employees and give them a level of comfort as well, which is what we did in the case of Sony Pictures, because in that instance, the actual employees were being threatened also. So there's a lot of value that comes with engagement with the FBI. So I think that's the number one thing, is just, don't make it a check in the box where you're filing an IC3 complaint or you're having your counsel just call so that, you have your reporting requirement taken care of. Really look to engage the FBI. We're happy to put on threat briefings ad hoc as well for companies.
That's great info. Thanks, Albert. So, Rez, can you talk to us a little bit about what you've seen companies doing well? We talked a little bit some of the challenges, but what are people doing well, and also what are some of the areas that folks could improve on as well?
Sure, and thanks, Robert. If I could just quickly talk about the law enforcement thing, I support 100% working with the FBI, Secret Service, other agencies. A lot of companies regulated by DFS are global. I'm at a global law firm, and I can tell you that that's not always the same level of cooperation internationally, and the trust isn't the same. So we should all be so lucky that we do get to deal with the FBI. I know I was recently talking with the legats in London and in Australia. They're working with law enforcement there to have the same level of cooperation, but that, I think, is a more evolving area than working with the FBI and the teams here. And so it's something to keep in mind as you think through some of these global incidents. What we see companies doing well and not so well. First and foremost, communications, internal communications. Companies that have done tabletops and have done it with their different operating companies and their different businesses, especially global companies, those that do it well have practiced that clear communication between the business units, between the different functional areas, and it is seamless. They have a command and control structure that is followed by collaboration. Companies that don't do it well have silos. Each business is running on its own. There's no twice a day central phone calls in which everyone is present. They're keeping out certain functions that need to be there, and the response is therefore equally disjointed as their response effort is. And I think that is one of the critical differences in doing it well and not. And I think that's where tabletop exercises are the easiest solution to that, and doing it around the world with all your operating companies independently and then together. True experts. Companies that do it well, as I talked earlier, know the true experts, and they have retained them in advance. Today, with the continued war on talent, whereas a year ago, maybe you didn't need to have retainers, now it's getting more and more that you do need to have retainers. I know that's expensive, but the retainers for some of the leading incident response firms are essential if you want to have them on and ready to work with you. So definitely something important. Companies that do it well are considering privilege. There has been some case law. I don't necessarily agree with where the courts have gone on this, but they have held that a lot of the engagements within incident response vendors don't get protected by attorney-client privilege, depending on how you engage with them. So there has been a new way that law firms and the incident response vendors are engaging, separating it out from the business as usual work to create true, in anticipation of litigation and regulatory enforcement relationships. So doing it well means thinking through that. Certainly working with law enforcement and regulators. I would say that everyone should know their local FBI agents. They should sit down with them. They should have lunch with them. You'd be surprised at how willing they are to do that. Again and again, I hear people say, really, they're having lunch with me? And yeah, that's actually part of their mission is outreach. And I think that companies that do it well have a relationship well in advance and then call those FBI agents and say, hey, have you seen this type of incident? Can you share information? You'd be amazed at how well that is and how much credit you get within your organization when you bring that to the table. And then finally, I would say companies that do it well practice. So turning it over to my fellow panelists, but practice is perfect.
Tracy, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's all about practice. I mean, that's what we see in claims handling. Those who have practiced what they have put together definitely have a much smoother process. Having your vendors lined up, as we said before, very important. Knowing all of the key stakeholders, knowing your claims handler, your insurance company, knowing who you're working with at the FBI. All of these things should be established before, as when an attack happens, it's a crisis situation. And so those are things that need to be done ahead of time. And from the insurance perspective, we certainly engage with the FBI, and it is a very good relationship. And we encourage our clients to also work with the FBI. We talked about a number of things that they could help with, but we also have a lot of situations right now where attacks are being conducted by actors who are potentially linked back to sanctioned entities. Working with law enforcement that can help give some guidance on those issues as you're going through the event. And also we find FBI will have access to, in a ransomware situation, decryption keys. And sometimes those decryption keys come out later, and you may not have ever retrieved your information. So you want to know that if the keys do become available, you want to be able to access them. So even if it's a month or two or more later, that you could still go back and get your data. So definitely a very important relationship, and practice is the key to really making a difference and being prepared. And insurance is part of that, having their insurance in place and having these vendors in place and all of the relationships. That's what's going to really make a difference in the handling of an incident.
Perfect. Thanks, Tracy. I know, Amit, you touched on this earlier, but anything you want to add from the FBI side on this?
No, I think like we said earlier, just engagement and just picking up that phone and making that initial contact, it goes a long way.
Perfect. So I know we're running short on time, so we're going to skip ahead here a couple of topics. And one of the things, Tracy, you mentioned earlier was on sanctions. So as we all know, on February 24th, Russia invaded the Ukraine, and this ongoing crisis has really had a broad impact across the globe. So cyber is one among many risks that we're going to talk about. And like many organizations, DFS has been working around the clock to respond to this ongoing crisis. So on February 25th, we published an industry letter. And industry letter did a couple of different things, but it primarily highlighted some of the key cyber concerns and also DFS's commitment to ensure that those sanctions that are being imposed are enforced across the board for all Russian entities. So Tracy, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the key threats that we're facing today as a result of this ongoing crisis?
I mean, this is an escalation. Every day there's something happening in cybersecurity. There's new escalation of events. We're looking at the same types of attacks. We can expect, ransomware attacks, continued business email compromise, denial of service attacks. There is an expectation that we're in a heightened threat environment, and we will see more of that type of activity. So, I think that certainly there's major events that are happening in the world, but when you look at guidance that's being provided by governments and others, it's still the same basic controls. Like you have to have the foundational controls. You have to understand your network, understand your assets, have visibility, make sure that you're not using outdated software, unsupported software, that you're patching regularly. Vulnerabilities that are known will be exploited. There probably are some, there's unknown vulnerabilities that will probably be exploited too. But you need to have protections in place to compensating controls that can help your organization be able to recover from those types of events. So we definitely are expecting activity has been significant through all of last year. There's been times where it feels like there's a little bit of a lull, but we're certainly continuing. There's continuing threats out there, and we can continue to. We expect to see more activity, but I think it's going to be more of the same. The level of it could certainly increase, and the protections that you need to have in place are the protections that we've been talking about and have been reinforced, making sure that you're protecting how attackers enter your network, how they move across the network, how they gain privileged access, and for ransomware specifically, making sure that you're protecting your domain administration access and service accounts. And that's really having protections around that is what we find makes the difference in whether or not a ransomware event is successful.
Absolutely appreciate it. And how are you seeing that organizations are responding to these growing threats across the board?
Yeah, look, the ransomware threat is a difficult one, and we're seeing companies taking real thoughtful approaches to this. Obviously, we've had some really good guidance coming out of OFAC and Treasury, FinCEN, and of course DFS about ransomware and the importance of having a sanctions compliance program, working with law enforcement, reporting to Treasury. And so those are some of the critical elements of establishing that type of response within a company. Then for the law department to consider this, and going back to the issue of disclosures, real importance of working really closely with the information security team. That's where I learned as a lawyer, you can't have a tie on, because the information security team, they don't like ties. The cyber guys, they don't like ties. You want to have real close relationships with them. They don't even like button-down shirts, I discovered. So you really want to learn about all their incidents. And then as it gets escalated, you're there and you know about them. You say, okay, I know that that's run of the mill. That's nothing. I know that that's just an event. That's an incident, maybe not big enough. I know that something is bigger than a bread box. And now we need to start escalating that. Now we need to start considering these other issues. So that partnership between the legal department, and I love how Amit talked about having the information security department working within the legal department, new developments, seen that for sure in some places. That's a critical partnership, and I'm seeing more and more of that partnership, that role of counsel. And then probably a newer role, and one that's still developing, is where does compliance fit in? How do compliance departments fit in? You have the information security department doing a lot of work. You now have cyber counsel and then the risk department. And so where does compliance fit in? And I think a compliance department for legal is really important. They are professionals that are dealing with measuring compliance, and the other professionals are not. That's not what they're trained in. And so having compliance sitting down at the table, helping to actually check and avoid some of the enforcement actions that we've seen that say, oh, we had MFA, and it turns out it was only for a certain segment of the population. Well, a good compliance department would have helped figure that out, and I think that we need to see more of that, and we're seeing more of that. So credit where it's due for the compliance departments.
Absolutely. I can attest that InfoSec guys don't like collared shirts or ties as well. So absolutely. So Amit, can you close it out for us and really talk about what organizations should be focused on to respond?
Yeah, I think look from a network defense perspective, focus on the cyber fundamentals. I mean, they're boring, right? But it's, wash, rinse, repeat, right? So it's, not two-factor, multi-factor authentication. I've got, I don't know, three different cards or something like that that I've got to carry around, and if I don't have them, I'm not getting on the network that day. Um, then it's, proper network segmentation is important, particularly for the ransomware piece. A lot of what I've seen in terms of companies being compromised, it's a totally flat network. There is no segmentation. You can go from one end of the network to the other, zero segmentation in the network, in the network, right? So focus on those cyber fundamentals, right? And that's where DHS, CISA, they've got some great, best practices around that, and that's publicly available on their websites. And then, those core 4 or 5 fundamentals that I just mentioned, right? Apply the frameworks to them. So you've got NIST, you've got the CMCC, and now you've got, zero trust that's out there as well, right? Which, quite frankly, it's great in theory. It's a lot hard. It's a lot harder in practice. And hopefully, as the technology catches up, we'll get there. But I'll end with kind of just one notion that Luke Domboski on the previous panel pointed out, which is, look, within your, because what we've seen, we didn't get to talk about supply chain, right? But what we've seen in the supply chain, at least from my perspective, is, these are all tools. Like if you take Pulse VPN, for example, that's a VPN client that's being used, I think something like in 80% of financial institutions, right? Like that is a problem. So if you have Pulse VPN, we've seen now, threat actors go after Pulse VPN and have a 0-day for that, twice in the last, 3 to 4 years, right? So really taking a look at, do we need to have what everyone else has because that's the new or hottest thing that's out there and everyone's doing it, therefore, we have to have it too, right? Because it does come with its own set of risks. And so really, talking to your IT folks, if you look at all the supply chain attacks, these are all tools that all the IT folks love, right? Because they work, they're easy to use, right? They work for them. But, really taking a look at, do we need those? And then articulating yourself around that and having a conversation with that provider too. You need to know that there's proper, kind of code sanitization, these types of things that are happening with somebody that's providing you software as a service, right? So I would end on that, is really taking a look at, what are the tools that you're using to administer your network, and then, spidering out from there.
Perfect. Thanks, Amit. So in essence of time, we got one final question that we're going to ask the panelists today to wrap things up. So Tracy, can you kick it off for us? If you can make one recommendation, what is something that all organizations can do to better protect themselves against cyber threats?
Yeah, it's so hard to wrap that up in one item. But it's if I had to say one thing, I guess it would really be around education. There's a lot of material that's out there. You can get information from DFS, from CISA, from the FBI of what the basic the core controls organizations need to have in place. And you're going to see some common things that were mentioned about network segmentation, MFA, and other things. Those patching is super important. We just received a claim today that came in from a vulnerability from August of 2020. I mean, that should not be open anymore when there's a patch available. It's, those types of things that are hanging out there. That's where you're seeing attackers compromise them. So know what's out there and build your protections around that. And of course, communicate was such a something that we emphasized quite a bit here. But that's a key one as well, is the communication and working together and practicing your procedures beforehand.
Absolutely, great advice. Amit.
Yeah, I'll just end on what I had mentioned earlier in the talk, which is focus on your people, hire for the best, and train for the best, and you should be in a good position.
Absolutely. Rez, you want to bring it home for us?
Sure, I love those, and people, ultimately the right people are going to get you to the right things for sure. That's awesome. I'll go back to risk assessments, but real risk assessments that are done for your organization and can't fit to anybody else. They're the roadmap to success.
Absolutely. And I would say for me, IT asset management, and Justin Herring will laugh when I say this, that everything in InfoSec starts and ends with IT asset management. If you don't know what you have, you can't hope to protect it. But we've only got a few minutes left, so I just want to wrap things up. Really good recommendations from everybody across the board, and really a great way for us to close out the first day here at the DFS Cyber Symposium. I just wanted to thank everybody for taking time out of your day to join us. I sincerely hope that it was time well spent. Also, a very big thank you to all of our panelists today for sharing your thoughts, your perspectives, and most importantly, your expertise. So today's discussion, as Justin mentioned earlier, is the first of a series of upcoming sessions for the DFS Symposium. We hope that you're able to join us on April 26th to talk about the human factor, and on the May 24th, where we're going to spotlight the small businesses. Again, thank you everybody for your time, and hopefully we'll see everybody again soon in April. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.